Guys, we're going to dedicate this particular shir to Keith Tabakin's late mom who passed away. Her name is Rute but Yaakov, and obviously all of us know Keith Tabakin well. I can personally tell you that he's one of the most incredible people I've ever met. He spends his entire day doing chesed.
There's a lot of good.
He does a fortune of good. When my mom passed away and I was stuck in Israel, he made sure that she was taken care of at the chev with Eddie. He does mitzvahs every day. Keith is considerate of every human being. His dedication to humanity, to Hashem, is amazing. And I'm sure, obviously, his mom must be very proud. So we do this share in dedication to her. And Kevin, start by teaching us the halachas.
Okay, so we're continuing discussing the laws of Shemitah. And this is the publication I was given to Rav Stuart Shmuel Weiss of the Jewish Outreach Center of Rona. So continuing now with the next section, which is what fruits and vegetables may I eat during Shemitah? Okay, it goes on to say, well, let's see how far we go with this. Okay. There are various ways in which one can practically continue eating produce in Eretz Yisrael during Shemitah. Produce of the 6th year, that's the year prior to Shemitah, has no Kedushat Shvi'it and may be eaten as usual. Truma and Maisa would be taken from this produce. Then it says in brackets, a note, 6-year produce, or the year before Shemitah year, may be frozen or dried and used in the 7th year with no Kedushat Shvi'it. It doesn't have the Kedusha of the 7th year, which is the Shemitah year, which, as Steve, in case you didn't know, it started on Rosh Hashanah this year. It started a couple of weeks back. Vegetables grown out of the soil, hydroponically or in a hothouse, have no Kedushat Shvi'it. Truma and Maisa should still be taken, but without a bracha. And then Otse Beit Din or Otse Haaretz refers to produce that is grown on Jewish land, planted in the 6th year and harvested in the 7th, which has been turned over to the Beit Din. Agents of the Beit Din collect the produce and offer it to the public. The money paid for this produce covers only the expenses incurred by the Beit Din and not the produce itself. Such produce offered at specially designed outlets has Kedushat Shvi'it and must be treated in a special manner. Truma and Maisa is not taken from this produce. And let's do the last one here. Produce from one's own property, which is sufficient for himself and his family, may be eaten as usual. This produce has Kedushat Shvi'it as well as Truma, but Truma and Maisa need not be taken. One should declare his property hefka, which means ownerless, so that anyone, including himself, may eat from it. Okay, let's leave it for there. So Kedushat Shvi'it means the holiness of the 7th year. Okay. That's what 7th, it doesn't literally mean 7th holiness. Shvi'it is the Shemitah year is the 7th year. Every 7th year it occurs. So that's to be continued next time.
Okay.
It's actually interesting because you talk about the word ownerless. So with Bava Kamma in the 7th year, all your pits in your land become ownerless. All the area around it becomes ownerless in the Shemitah year. So it changes the whole ramifications of everything. It's quite interesting, eh? You see that, Damon, eh?
Yeah, I'd need to speak to Rabbi Cohen. In fact, if it's ownerless in terms of deriving benefit, but it also includes liability, or if liability is an exclusive factor, separate to deriving benefit and ownership. There might be two different factors. Does that?
No, I'm just saying it's interesting. It might not be impacted at all, but I'm just saying it is interesting because it could impact. So it's worth looking at.
It definitely could impact, and I'm not making a statement either way. All I'm saying is that one, just like something becomes muksa for use on Shabbat, doesn't mean that if you dropped a hammer on somebody's head on Shabbat, even though you shouldn't have a hammer in your head, you wouldn't have to pay for the hospital bill. I'm not sure. I'm not sure the degree of liability versus beneficial incumbent. I'm not sure. You might be right. I don't know. We'd have to speak to Rabbi Cohen. It's a good point. We'll speak to him, in fact. So they might just stop ownership in terms of benefit, like you can't collect rental or derived benefit from produce in the Shemitah year, because otherwise, if there's money involved, then people sometimes are lax with the law. I'm not sure. It would be interesting to find out. Remind me when you speak to Rabbi Cohen, please, God. It's a good question. Excellent question. All right. So what I'm going to do for Keith's mom is I just want to read this this Mishnah in full, because Mishnah Neshama, it's customary. So I think if Gavin can read the Mishnah, I'm going to share the screen for what we're doing on the Gemara at the moment. That would be much appreciated, Gav. Okay, why? Because Arthur doesn't know Keith. You do. You know, you've got a good kesher with him. All right. Gav, you want to read the Mishnah?
I'm just waiting for it to appear. It hasn't appeared yet.
It doesn't appear yet?
Yes.
I see it.
There we go. Just took a few seconds to pop up. Okay. Mishnah. The Mishnah continues this discussion of a ball belonging to partners. That's where the spelling is. If the first one covered the fish after he used it, and the second one then came to use it and found it uncovered, and he did not cover it, the second one is exclusively liable for any damage he does. The Mishnah now discusses liability for any ball. If one covered a fish properly, and nevertheless an ox or a donkey walking over it fell into it and died, he is exempt. If he did not cover the fish properly, and an ox or donkey fell into it and died, he is liable. The Mishnah returns to a case where an animal was caused to fall into a pit by an external factor. If the animal fell forward because of the sound of the person digging, the owner of the pit is liable. If it fell backwards because of the sound of the digging, he is exempt. The Mishnah discusses what type of damage the owner of the pit is liable to pay for. If an ox with its utensils fell into a pit and the utensils broke, or a donkey with its utensils fell into a pit and the utensils tore, the owner of the pit is liable to pay for damage to the animal, but is exempt from paying for damage to the utensils. If an ox that is deaf, deranged, or young fell into a pit, the owner of the pit is liable. If a young, just move it up a bit, sorry, Damon. If a young boy or girl, it's just cutting me off, mate, it's just my side. If a young boy or girl, or a Canaanite slave, or a maid servant, Damon, just lift it a bit, sorry. Thank you. If a young boy or girl, Canaanite slave, or a maid servant fell into a pit and died, the owner of the pit is exempt.
Excellently read. So the part that we're discussing in this part of the Gemara, because the Mishnah obviously lays itself out in the Gemara where we study each and every section. For Rute but Yaakov, for Keith Tabakin's mom, we're dealing with a case where it's the middle section, where it says the Mishnah discusses liability for a bull. If one covered a pit properly, and nevertheless an ox or donkey walking over it fell into it and died, he is exempt. If he did not cover the pit properly, and an ox or donkey fell into it and died, he is liable. So that's the specific section of the Mishnah that we're dealing with in this Gemara Shir. Okay. Rabbi Meir, please teach us.
Okay, esteemed Rabbonim, Talmidei Chachamim, and Tzaddikim, continuing with the theme of Shemitah, and the next point is what is the reason for this mitzvah? There are 4 reasons, and says Chazal offers numerous reasons for the mitzvah Shemitah. These include recognition that the land ultimately belongs to Hashem and not man, and He dictates its usage. increasing our dependence upon and faith in Hashem to provide for our sustenance, providing a unique vehicle to give to the poor who have access in the Shemitah year to fields and produce, and giving Klal Yisrael an opportunity to recharge our spiritual batteries, as work in the field is ideally decreased and Torah study may then be increased. Okay, that I wasn't aware of.
Explain.
Okay, then it says people will be able to concentrate more on their learning Torah. Will have more time to dedicate to it. That's what it's saying. That's just I thought it was only agricultural. It's good.
I think I want to ask you something. I think what they mean is that when you're not toiling the land because you give it a rest, you meant to use that time instead of as an agricultural activity to learn Torah. I don't think it means something so abstract as it necessarily automatically, Kabbalistically always helps you. I think you're not toiling the land. Therefore, what else are you doing but learning Torah?
More time on your hands.
Yeah.
And then it says, what is the reward for Shemitah observance?
Okay.
Hashem promises to reward the observance of Shemitah by providing for all our needs. Conversely, the punishment for non-observance of Shemitah is galut, from the land, which means exile. Okay. And let's just do one more paragraph here, because the next one's going to be quite comprehensive. When does the prohibition of Shemitah begin? This is agricultural work at one time prohibited 30 days prior to Rosh Hashanah of the Shemitah year. Today, however, rabbinic law permits work right up until Rosh Hashanah. Most vegetables require Shemitah status, and that's called Kedushat Shvi if picked after the 3rd of Tishrei 5782. Potatoes and beans are exceptions and become Shvi'it on 3 Mar Cheshvan and on the 1st of Nisan respectively. Mushrooms are not considered vegetables and never attain Shvi'it status. Fruit becomes Shvi'it at various dates in 5782, mostly in the spring. Okay, so let's just leave it at that.
Okay. I didn't know that. Mushrooms are fungi.
That's right, yes. That's right.
It's not even a Hadamah who I ate. It's interesting. Arthur, are you on the shear?
Yeah, I'm just eating, so I don't want to like...
No, I'd rather see you eating and see you, because it's okay. Do you agree?
Very much.
Seeing your face cheers me up, mate. It's fine. Gavin eats, you eat. It's normal. There's hypoglycemia. I'd rather see your face. There's no issue. It's a treat. All right. We're gonna begin the share. Kevin, you taught me a lot, actually. Thanks, man. And
I also learned there from there. It just shows how comprehensive it is and involved. So no, it's good. I'm glad I found this just something different. We'll go back to the other stuff afterwards. No.
I'm happy. Let's just hit the Gemara share now. We don't have much time. And just officially for the record, for those that have commented on YouTube videos and other things as to the fact that I don't wear a kippah, when I give a shir, I do wear a kippah. I just, thank God, have got a lot of hair. So just for the record, guys,
I've got the same problem. Just for the record, what's the word?
Okay, we both wear our kippahs back. So
that's
I need a haircut. Yeah, and Arthur's. I take my hat off to you. Kevin would like that. And let's get started. All right. Now, just one thing with this Gemara that you got to know that we're about to tackle is I'm going to go through it rather quickly first and then give the explanation afterwards. Because if I stop at every point and give the explanation, it's not tedious. God forbid I say the Gemara tedious. I'm saying me giving the explaining it, saying it. It's actually better just to go. I've thought about this on Shabbos. Go through this quickly, and then afterwards put it together. So I hope you can trust my instincts here for this one. Just until we get to the Rabbi Nassan part, which is very interesting. I like that. All right. So, guys, we're on the 52nd daf, A3 in your Schottenstein Gemara. So the Mishnah states, if one covered a pit properly, and nevertheless an ox or donkey walking over it fell into it and died, he is exempt. Okay? Because if you remember the first part of the Mishnah is talking about this exemption, and the second part with liability. So that's the status. I'll repeat it again. If one covered a pit properly, and nevertheless an ox or donkey walking over it fell into it and died, he is exempt. So now the Gemara is going to wonder, what do you mean he covered it properly? If he covered it properly, how did the animal fall in? Okay, fair enough question. Rav Yitzchak bar Chana said, we are dealing with a case where the cover became wormy from within, so that it could no longer support the weight of the ox. In other words, the owner isn't liable to pay in this particular case. Why? Because his job was to cover the bull properly, to make sure that it was a snug fit of strong wood, etc. And he's not obligated to regularly go and inspect the cover for interior damage by worms. Why? Because it wasn't common then to have worms. That's what the Rosh says. So it wasn't a common occurrence. And also I think that they did have a technique where they would cover the pit cover. You know, like today we do sealant or waxing or tar or pitting. I mean, they had it there. I mean, predominantly they had wood, so they had methods of sealing it. So it wasn't too common if it wasn't going to rot from without, that it would rot from within. And because it's not common, you don't have to go and inspect it regularly, providing the structural strength is there. Okay. Now, a related inquiry is cited. They inquired if one covered his pit with a cover that can withstand the weight of oxen, but not withstand the weight of camels, and the camels came by and damaged the cover. Why would it damage the cover? Because obviously camels are far heavier, and their walking technique is different to oxen. Both that with their combined weight means that if it was made sturdy, do you remember the Mishnah only said if you made it sturdy for oxen and donkeys? It didn't mention anything about camels. So now he's saying, well, hang on a second. If there are camels that come in and damage the cover, but what actually created the damage? The camels didn't fall in. The oxen, when the cover was already weakened, broke under the weight of the oxen, threw the damaged cover and fell into the pit. What's the law? Is the owner of the pit liable to pay for the ox or not? In other words, if a camel had fallen into the pit and died, it's obvious you're liable to pay for it, according to Rashi. Why? Because you're negligent with regards to camels. That doesn't need mentioning. If it's an area that's common for camels, you haven't made it sturdy for camels, Rashi says you're obligated. But here we're talking about indirect damages. Why? The camels weakened it and created it to be susceptible to breakage for oxen. Then are you responsible for the indirect damage? So the consideration is maybe you're not negligent in regard to oxen because it's what do you call it, indirect. Or else you have to consider the possibility that the camel might come in and fall, even if you dig a pit in an area where camels are a little, well, not relatively common. So then you're not considered negligent because you don't have to think of the combined possibilities. In other words, a camel will come by and then it would weaken the lid and then an ox would fall in. So those are the two issues that we're grappling with. I mean, others explain it as follows. It's like if you create a bull that is an operative hazard. What do I mean by an operative hazard? I mean, the very fact that there's a pit means that it's a stationary drama waiting to happen. Okay, and it's an optimum. So if camels in its current state get damaged by it, you can't excuse yourself for paying for the damage to camels by basically claiming you didn't expect them to come by. But since it's not a hazard to oxen at the moment, and it can become hazardous to oxen, if camels come by and then they weaken it, perhaps if that occurs, you're not responsible. So those are the two ways that it's brought forward. You know, the one is brought forward by Rabbeinu Peretz, the other one by Tosfot. So there's slightly different ways to explain, that concept that we're dealing with. Am I making sense, guys?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Kev and Arthur disappeared. I really like you guys to be on.
I'm listening. Sorry, I'll be another minute.
Thanks. I was adjusting my screen because the stand underneath wasn't straight. So this was my laptop was falling down.
Pretty much. We're going to have a show where it's just me and 3 black screens. And I will call it the new BE affirmative action policy. So,
white screen.
yeah.
Black screen may be fun. I don't know. Maybe it's a problem.
Yeah. I don't know. So that's basically the issue that we're dealing with. So the Gemara now seeks a clarification. Okay. So what's the case regarding which you inquire? That's what the Gemara wants to know. If it's a case where camels are common in that area, then the owner of the pit was obviously negligent, even in regard to oxen. Why? Because he should have realized that camels could weaken his cover and oxen would then fall through. And if it's a case where camels are not common in the area at all, but by chance there was a camel that came and ruined the cover, then obviously the person's blameless. So the Gemara is saying, I don't understand the question here. It's either one or the other. So Kevin, I want you to give it over, just that last statement, to see that we're all on the same page.
Okay, I did go. Okay, I won't go and give up everything.
No, just the last idea. The Gemara is saying that.
Okay, it's the last idea. Okay, so if the owner of the pit or the creator of the pit has a cover and the cover was solid and secure, and they happen to be that's sufficient. And if camels are of a heavier weight, and there are lots of camels in there, and they're known to pass through the area on a regular basis, then maybe the cover should be strengthened. And then if oxen or other animals fall into it, then there's liability. But if camels pass through infrequently, then there's no liability.
Perfect.
Is that it?
Perfect. Kevin, you couldn't have said it better. That's exactly right. I mean, if you're expecting camels, as Kevin said, and it's frequenting in the area, you obviously have to know you're responsible for indirect damage, because you've got to look at probability. And therefore, even if ox get damaged by it and it's strong enough for oxen, but you know it's an area where heavier animals come in, you're liable, as Kevin said. And if there's an area where camels are not common, and the odd random camel comes and stands on the cover, weakens and an ox falls in, then you're not liable. You were negligent. So what's there to talk about? Exactly as Kevin said, that's the Gemara's question. Like, what is there even to talk about? So now we need to actually clarify the inquiry. It's necessary to inquire only regarding, a case where camels come by that area occasionally. And we inquire as follows. Do we say that since camels come by there occasionally, he was negligent? For he should have considered the possibility that, in fact, they could come by and render the cover of the pit unfit, even for oxen. Or perhaps we say that since now, that when he's covering the pit, they're not actually camels in the area at the moment, and it's occasional, but it's not common, so therefore he's blameless for not realizing that they would come by and ruin the cover. So that's where the question is covered, not in an area where it's completely infrequent or common. We're saying, what about that middle ground? How much liability, what's that sweet spot in terms of where your liability rests? So a solution is proposed. Come learn a resolution from our Mishnah. This Mishnah we learned, which teaches if one covered a pit properly and nevertheless an ox or a donkey walking over it fell into it and died, he is exempt. What is the precise case to which the Mishnah refers? If you say that it's a case where the man covered the pit properly for both oxen and camels, then how did the animal fall in? Rather, is it not clear that the Mishnah means that the man covered it properly for oxen, but not properly for camels? And camels came along and damaged the cover so that the ox later came and he fell through it. Certainly this must be the case. Now, again, guys, the question reasserts itself. If this occurred in a place where camels are common, the owner clearly is liable. He was negligent. in ignoring the possibility that camels could come and damage the cover. And if it occurred in a place where camels are not common, then it's obviously it's exempt, since he's blameless. Why? Because if the odd camel comes, then that can't be the case. So the Mishnah doesn't need to teach this. Rather, and this is where the Gemara is trying to summarize, it says, is it not presumable that we're dealing with a case where camels come by? Occasionally. In other words, not never and not frequently. Like that middle road. And camels actually came by and damaged the cover of the pit, and it weakened it, right? And oxen came by and fell into it. And the Mishnah teaches that the owner of the pit is exempt. So it's saying maybe this Mishnah is teaching a chidush, a novelty, that despite this, the owner of the pit is exempt. Thus, we see now that when he's covering the pit, there are not any camels in the area. So in other words, if at the point where you're covering the pit, the Gemara is suggesting, then you can discern that you don't see any camels. You're considered blameless for the damage that eventually occurred when the weakening of the cover occurred when camels subsequently came back. Okay? So that's what the Gemara is proposing, that the Mishnah is trying to teach us. Now, guys, what do you think of that? What is each of your opinions? You have to unmute to give me your opinions.
So,
All right, Kevin, go for it.
no, Kevin, go ahead. No, just a thought. I don't know if I've...
We used to do that at school when people would say, Damon, go for it. I'd say, no, you go for it.
So,
Arthur's mastered that technique at school, by the way. Yeah?
Yeah. Is it... You have to, the possibility that a camel could come and could come into the vicinity and damage the cover should be taken into account and maybe dealt with. And I don't know.
Okay, so on what you're saying, the Gemara is saying maybe the Mishnah is coming to teach us a novel point. And that point of it is, maybe if you're working on the cover at the time, Gavin, and you don't see any camels, you're off the hook, you're blameless. Because you can't determine frequent, infrequent, common, maybe never. You maybe look at the situation at the time, are there camels? No. You put down the cover, you're blameless. So the Gemara is saying maybe that's what the Mishnah is trying to propose. And it's just making a suggestion, And the answer is that the Gemara rejects it. It's saying, no, look, whoever brought that suggestion, that ain't what the Mishnah is trying to teach by any stretch of the imagination. So they say, no, actually the Mishnah means that the owner covered the pit properly for both oxen and camels. And as for your question, how did the animal fall in? Rav Yitzchak Bava Kamma said, we are dealing with a case where the cover became wormy from within, and the owner is not liable in such a case. So our last statement was, Rav Yitzchak Bava Kamma had said, we are dealing with a case where the cover became wormy from within, and the owner is not liable in such a case as explained above. The Gemara proposes an opposite resolution to the inquiry. What was the opposite resolution? Because at first when we dealt with this particular Mishnah, we were talking about the exemption status. If you cover a boar properly. Here we're trying to infer the liability status. So we're actually switching the discussion from a different point of view to try and see if we can get to a head of the matter. So come learn a different resolution from the next clause of our Mishnah, which teaches, if he did not cover the pit properly, and an ox or a donkey fell into it and died, he is liable. So we want to know what is the precise case in which the Mishnah refers. If you want to say that the Mishnah means that he didn't cover the pit properly for either oxen or camels, then its ruling is obvious in terms of liability. Is it necessary to say that he's liable to pay for the damage for oxen? Rather, is it not presumable that the Mishnah means that a person covered the pit properly for oxen, but not properly for camels, and camels came through and damaged the cover, so that the ox later fell through it when the camels actually created a weakening of the cover through their weight, for example. So it's suggesting certainly this must be the case. And in what situation is the Mishnah's ruling applicable? If this occurs in a place where camels are common, then again, guys, as discussed, it's obvious that the owner of the pit is liable. This is something Gavin mentioned. Since he was clearly negligent in ignoring the possibility that that camels would damage the cover and oxen would then fall in. So the Mishnah doesn't need to teach us exactly. So we're talking about a case where if it is at all probable, not for the odd camel, but the commonality is there, then there's a liability for negligence. There's nothing to discuss. And so if you want to say then, okay, then let's learn in a case where camels are not common, then in that particular case, why should the owner of a pit be liable? He's blameless. That's what the Gemara says, for not realizing that camels would come along and render the cover unfit for oxen, because we're talking about a place where camels don't frequent at all. So it's saying here, let's get to grips with the case. Rather, is it not presumable that we're dealing with a situation where camels come by occasionally? And the key word here, guys, is occasionally. And camels actually came back and damaged the cover of the pit. And oxen then came by and fell into it. So even though it's indirect, in other words, the cause of the damage was the camels, and you weren't negligent in terms of creating a cover for oxen because it's the right weight. If camels do come there occasionally, surely you are liable for the fact that there is a likelihood that the weight of the camel will damage it and render it weakened, so that when oxen finally come and fall into it, there's a certain amount of liability in your case. And the Mishnah teaches that the owner of the pit in this case is liable. Thus we see that since camels come by occasionally, the owner of the pit is considered negligent in regard to oxen, and the person can't say, well, I made it strong enough for oxen, because he has to take into account the calculation that heavier animals would render it, even though the Mishnah says oxen and donkeys, would render the cover of the pit to be considerably weak, and therefore he should have considered the possibility that in fact camels would come by and render the cover of the pit inadequate even for oxen. Okay, so guys, just want to ask you something. Do you think that this proposal, the Gemara is happy with it so far, or do you think there's a flaw in it?
Well, they might not be thrilled about the fact that it's very occasional that it happens.
Okay, good point.
That could be that could be the only thing. I still think, in my opinion, if camels come across there, even if it's once a month or once every 3 months, that you should take it into account. But if you've never seen camels in that area, then I think it's fair not to obviously build for camels. So once in a while, I would say so. But the Gemara, I think, from what I remember, does have a bit of an issue with it. Okay. I think it has to be quite frequent in order for the guy to have made it more robust for camels.
Okay, so I think Gavin's brought up two good points. Is that the fact of it is that you have to, well, he said it very succinctly. He said earlier on about due diligence. I don't think you can just take your own visuals for it. Gavin implied when we spoke to him that due diligence also accounts for asking people around the area that live there, not just looking around and or judging on your experience as a tourist, for example, or in an area you don't frequent. So let's see what the Gemara says. By the way, when we finish this particular part of the Gemara, I'll give you an entire explanation as to why it was brought up. But let's just cover as much ground as possible quickly. Now, the proof is rejected. Why? Because actually the Mishnah refers to a case where the pit was covered properly for oxen, but not properly for camels, and camels are common in that area. And as for your question, the owner of the pit was negligent. It's obvious that he's liable. Why did the Mishnah need to teach this? The answer is that this clause is indeed superfluous. But since the Tana deals in the first clause with a case in which the owner covered the pit properly, And it also deals with the latter clause, or the opposite case in which the owner did not cover the pit properly. Okay? So what it's saying is that since the Gemara conceded that the latter clause is superfluous, I mean, talking about, what's the latter clause? Talking about liability. It's actually dealing with a case where it wasn't covered at all, even for oxen. So what it's saying is it's just a juxtaposition between the first statement of exemption versus liability that the Gemara mirrors the statement. And that in that particular case, it wasn't even suitably covered for oxen. So the Gemara is going to try and see if there's more to it than that. So an alternative version to the inquiry is proposed. There are those who say regarding this case too, in which one covered is pit properly for oxen, but not for camels, in an area where camels come by occasionally, and they actually come by and ruin the cover, we certainly do not inquire whether the owner of the pit is liable for subsequent damage to oxen. Because since camels come by there occasionally, he is clearly considered negligent regarding oxen, since he should have considered the possibility that camels would come by and damage the cover and oxen would then fall through it. Rather, when we inquired, this is how we inquired. If one covered his pit with a cover that can withstand the weight of oxen, but cannot withstand the weight of camels, and camels are common in that area, but camels did not come along and damage the cover. Rather, it became wormy from within. What do we mean wormy? We mean that there were, it was rotting. There were worms, or often the worminess in wood can be termites. It can be a prequel where they lay larvae and eggs so they can eat through wooden covers. Or wormy because it eats off, obviously, the moisture of the wood. So they're saying that, listen, even though he was negligent because camels are common there, and if camels had walked over it, it certainly would have rendered it, weakened for oxen. But in this particular case, he was negligent regarding camels. But the reason that the weight of the oxen couldn't be supported was because the covers themselves were wormy from within. So do we say that since the owner of the pit was negligent in regard to damaging of the cover by the camels, you also considered negligent with regards to worminess, or perhaps we do not say since he was negligent, etc. Okay, so a resolution is proposed. So I'm going to explain to you what this means. It's basically saying, look, if you are negligent in one regard, does that open you up to liability in another regard? Okay, let's just cover a bit more ground, and I'm going to give you a summary. Guys, I'm not quite sure why the Gemara with this case goes backwards and forwards. It does seem like a lot of repetition. That's why I just want to go through it. And at the end of it, if I just give you the bottom line, it's going to come to light. So please be patient with me. I'm so sorry about this. A resolution is proposed. Come learn the resolution from the Mishnah, which states if one covered a pit properly, and nevertheless an ox or a donkey walking over it fell into it and died, he is exempt. And it was stated regarding the Mishnah, Rav Yitzhak bar Bachana said, we're dealing with a case where the cover became wormy from within. Now, what's the precise case to which the Mishnah refers? If you say it's a case where the man covered the pit properly for both oxen and camels, and the cover became worthy from within, then it's obvious that he is exempt. For what could he have done to protect against this occurrence? Okay. In other words, the Gemara basically considers decay of through worminess or decay of wood as an unforeseeable problem. And it's deemed unreasonable to expect the pit's owner to constantly come and inspect the cover for worms. Okay. So in that particular case, the Mishnah is not going to teach the obvious. Rather, is it not presumable that the Mishnah means that the man covered the pit properly for oxen, but not properly for camels? And in a place where camels are common, so that he was negligent in regard to camels, but camels did not come by. And instead, the cover became wormy from within. And the Mishnah teaches that the owner of the pit is exempt. Thus, we see that we do not say that since he was negligent in regard to damaging the cover by camels, he is also considered negligent in regard to worminess. So the Gemara's first proposal here turns around and says, look, it's an area that was common for camels. Let's just take the extreme, not given that it had visited occasionally camels, but it was common. He didn't take into account, it happened to be that the oxen fell through and died because of the worminess of the cover. So we learn here, the Gemara is proposing, maybe we learn here that just because he was negligent with regards to camels doesn't mean he wasn't afforded the status of being protected against worminess as something that was an unusual occurrence. Does that make sense? Because you can't, the Gemara is proposing, how can you make liability for camels, make one lose liability for the worminess side? Does that, because it's not directly causative. So that's what the Gemara is proposing. So the proof is actually rejected. It says, no, actually we're dealing with a case where the owner covered the pit properly for both oxen and camels, and the cover became wormy from within. And as for your question, if the cover became wormy from within, what could the owner of the pit have done? What do they mean by that? It's obvious that he's exempt because he is not obligated to keep inspecting it. And the answer is as follows. You might have said that he should have gone to the pit regularly and banged on the cover forcefully to examine whether or not it had been hollowed out by worms, and that he's therefore considered negligent. The Mishnah therefore informs us that he's not required to do so. So the Gemara is saying, look, it has nothing to do with whether or not it was covered properly for camels or oxen. It was. It's the fact that you can't obligate for worminess because the guy's not meant to do regular checks on something of unusual damage, providing the cover itself was strong enough for those two animals. So now there's an opposite resolution proposed by the Gemara. And let's see how long we've got. I'm trying to go as quickly as I can. An opposite resolution to the inquiry is proposed. Come learn a different resolution from the next clause of our Mishnah, which states, if you did not cover the pit properly and an ox or a donkey fell into it and died, he is liable. What is the precise case which the Mishnah refers? If you say that the Mishnah means that he did not cover the pit properly for either oxen or camels, then is it necessary to say that he's liable to pay for the damage? That's obvious. Rather, it's not presumable for oxen. Just hang on a sec. Rather, is it not presumable that the Mishnah means that the person covered the pit properly for oxen, but not properly for camels? Now, if this occurred at a place where camels are common and camels came through and damaged the cover so that the ox later fell through, then the owner of the pit was clearly negligent in ignoring the possibility that camels would damage the cover. And it's obvious that he's liable. The Mishnah doesn't need to teach this because it's obvious. And if it occurred in a place where camels are not common, why should the owner of the pit be liable? He is blameless for not realizing that they would come along and ruin the cover. Rather, it's not presumable that we are dealing with a situation where camels are common, but the cover was not damaged by camels. Rather, it became wormy from within and an ox fell through it. And the Mishnah teaches that the owner of the pit is liable. Thus, we see that we do say that since he was negligent in regard to damaging of the cover by camels, he's also considered negligent in regard to damage with regards to worminess. So now the proposal is maybe if you're negligent with regards to one degree, you're not afforded protection in another degree where you're not generally liable. So it's proposing that. Then it says that proof is rejected. They say no. Actually, we're dealing with a case in which the pit was covered properly for both oxen, but not properly for camels. And camels are common in that area. And camels came along and damaged the cover, and oxen then came along and fell into the pit. And as for your question, it is obvious that he's liable since he was negligent in regard to camels damaging it. The answer is that this is indeed obvious. But since the Tana in the first clause deals with a case in which the owner covered the pit properly, he also deals with the latter clause in which the contrasting cases when the owner did not cover the pit properly. Okay, so this backwards and forwards, I just want to give you guys a summary. We've got about 4 minutes left, and hopefully this will help you guys. Okay, so the bottom line is the owner of the boar isn't required to go and inspect the cover for interior damage by worms. Why? This type of decay is an uncommon occurrence. Are you with me, guys? It's not common at all. So you don't have to regularly go and bang on the cover to check. Nevertheless, the Gemara suggests that in a case where the owner of the pit was negligent in some respect, in other words, let's just say he failed to consider the weakening of the cover by camels, his negligence automatically makes him liable for damage occurring through any cause, including worminess, okay? Even though he was not directly negligent regarding the particular occurrence. So this is the basis of thought. If a person digs a hole in the public domain, he could theoretically be held liable, even if he covers the hole. Why? And the cover breaks maybe in an unforeseeable manner. Why? Because he created the hazard negligently to start with. If he hadn't even made the pit in the first place, no animal could possibly have fallen there. So basically, by digging the pit, he opened up the avenue in the first place where an animal could be damaged. And it's temporarily mitigated by a cover. How do we know this? Remember it said in Shmot chapter 21, verse 33 to 34, the reason that you're exempt is because you make a cover. If a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, etc., he shall make restitution. So it excludes one who makes an adequate cover. Okay? However, the Gemara considers a theory and says that you have to create a cover to protect anybody against anything that's foreseeable damage, so that you've actually eliminated the hazard entirely. But if you make a cover that's partially effective, right, then what that means is that in a case that was unforeseeable damage like worminess, it doesn't give you protection if you were negligent in some other regard. So in other words, you're saying, if you were covered for camel weight, oxen, donkeys, the pit cover fit snugly and everything was good, and something uncommon happened, you covered. But the minute you're negligent in one regard, it's proposing a theory that even for an unrelated accident, the reason why you're negligent is you no longer afforded certain protections under the law because of your negligence in one area. Why? Because you created the pit to start with. And then proposing then perhaps the opposite, that maybe if you were negligent in regards to camel weight, but that's not where the damage occurred, then it's considered beyond your control and that you shouldn't be liable. So this is the discussion that that goes backwards and forwards. Does that make sense? In other words, are you responsible for the hazard entirely, or is there are there extenuating circumstances for exemption of liability?